Beatrice, thank you for this brilliant talk. You had me reminiscing about the mega events that punctuated my own life. I don't want to give away too much here, but it does start with Montreal Olympics, Vancouver Expo '86, and for the real connoisseurs, Commonwealth Games in Edmonton in 1978. How about that? Okay, so what we're going to do with our panel now is ask Shona and Philippe in the first instance to simply respond to what they've heard from Beatrice, and I think then also reflect, I guess, on the situation, the current situation we're in, and if they want to risk it, predictions they might have for what comes next. But before I hand over to them, I'll just do some quick introductions of them. So Shona is Chief Executive of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival Fringe Society, proclaimed the largest art festival in the world. She was also Chief Executive of Derry, Londonderry, UK City of Culture 2013, and chairs Walk the Plank, an internationally renowned outdoor art company. Philippe is the founder and CEO of Futurus, an organization dedicated to games innovation, sports, and esports. And he says he's much more like a conductor than a CEO. Philippe was also information director at the International Olympic Committee, working with the Olympic Games for over 25 years in different capacities. His first Olympics were in 1992 for Albertville, and he's been working ever since in complex event management. He was former senior advisor to the Dubai World Expo, now due for 2021. So I think I'm handing over first to Shona for her response, and then we'll come to Philippe.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you so much, Beatrice. I suspect, looking at Philippe, we could talk about these subjects all night long and respond to so many of the provocations you've raised there, meaty and rich. I think kind of the last thing you said is the thing that has really connected with me, is that there's an evolving situation and an evolving approach, and I think an evolving sophistication to how we consider and how we think about mega events. So I have great hope and great faith in the promise of mega events to do many of the things that were in that last word cloud: connect, be community focused, be relevant, prioritize health, environment, well-being. So I'm very hopeful, and I say that as somebody who's spent 30 years running major events. And my starting point, I think one of the things that really connected with me was heading up Belfast's bid to be European Capital of Culture way back when Belfast was still a city that was just emerging from a situation of civil conflict. And then going on to head up Derry, Londonderry as UK City of Culture. In both cases, an absolute turning point moment in those two cities. Cities that were mired in stories of negativity, of violence, of very dark pasts. So I think in those cases, you can't divorce the need for a mega event on the outputs of a mega event with the real need for a turning point, for something, a pivotal moment for change of narrative of a place, in the same way as you described in Glasgow and Liverpool, but even more acute actually in cities that have experienced direct violence and what we called the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I think where both of those cities, and Derry, Londonderry was an amazing, incredible year that was filled actually with all of those guiding principles in that last word cloud. It was about trying to find a way to do a mega event, but in a way that was absolutely relevant to the story of a place, and that would in some way progress both the local people, inspire local people, but absolutely give them ownership of it. And that kind of really worked. I suppose the thing that worked less well in both those cities was I feel there was a level of instrumentalization of the mega event, and it was looked at as a kind of panacea to solve all economic and cultural ills going forward. But if you're really going to capitalize on these moments, you need to have sustained investment. You need to have a sustained plan for what's going to come after the mega event ends, or you end up with tumbleweed and people confused and wondering what just happened, and when are we going to get some more of it? Edinburgh, on the other hand, is a completely different model, because Edinburgh's impetus was that turning point moment, as you described, after the horrors of the Second World War. The International Festival was established as a means of reconnecting people. The Edinburgh Fringe arose as almost an act of defiance, because local companies and theatre makers were excluded by the first curator of the International Festival, because they were seen as too amateur and not what he considered to be high art. So the Edinburgh Fringe is kind of rooted in a sort of cultural democracy and principles of open access, and anyone with a voice has a right to be heard. So there's a kind of speaking to Scottish values of freedom of expression and democracy that underpins that festival in a way. I suppose the challenge for whether it's the Edinburgh International Festival, the Fringe, the Edinburgh Tattoo, the Art Festival, the Book Festival, all of us that make up the collection of the Edinburgh festivals in August, the big challenge is the success, actually the sustained investment, the legacy, the continuing support from the City Council, from Scottish Government, to ensure that that Edinburgh retains that festival city title. And as a result, we've almost become a victim of our own success as the events grew and became more popular, and the very open access nature kind of belatedly has started to put them in tension with the city. Because effectively, in the collective of the Edinburgh festivals, you have the equivalent of an Olympic Games happening, but it happens every single year rather than every 4 years. And because it grew organically, I think the city didn't have time to prepare its infrastructure and to prepare its planning to deal with something as major happening in the city. So interestingly, this moment in time, I mean, we'd often said in the last couple of years, as Edinburgh got more and more sort of complaining about its festivals, and there was a kind of growing negative narrative, we had joked that, well, you know, if you were just to stop the festivals for 1 year, Edinburgh might appreciate them again. And lo and behold, coronavirus comes along, and the festivals have to be stopped for a year. And I think this is genuinely a real kind of proper moment. And I don't know a single festival director in Edinburgh who is not currently reflecting on all of the things in that last word cloud. How do we re-emerge? How do we come back relevant, connected, rooted, and respectful of all of those narratives that we've heard in the city over the last few years, and to come back in the best possible version of ourselves. And that's what I mean, kind of coming full circle about the evolution of a conversation and the evolution of learning in event managers, to kind of listen and to hear and to respond in a way that addresses some of those negatives that have emerged. The last thing I would reflect on is we're all about to face the prospect of Festival 2022, which is probably the single most contentious initiative that has emerged, and absolutely encapsulates all of those tensions between, you know, is it a Brexit festival that's celebrating something that so many people feel negative about, or is it really that kind of pivotal moment that everyone needs to come out and say, we've come through coronavirus, we've come through Brexit, and now we have to kind of work together again. And so, and I don't sit on either side, but I think there's a really kind of interesting tension for us all to grapple with there. Thanks, Beatrice.
Thanks, Shona. Yes, we'd forgotten about Festival 2022. Thank you for the reminder. I'm going to hand over now to Philippe.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Beatrice and Shona. I really enjoyed the discussion, and for me, there was something a bit weird about the concept of mega events, because as I was hearing Beatrice, every event now was tending to become a mega event. And for me, there is a very, very strong difference between the size and also the complexity of these elements. First of all, I would like to remind that all the mega events we know now, and for me they are free and only free, the Olympics, FIFA World Cup, and the World Expos, they all started as tiny events. And when we look back at the IOC, for instance, and we think of the first edition of the Games in 1896, there were 14 countries and 340 participants. So according to our understanding now, we would not call that a mega event. They evolved over time, and they evolved in complexity. And I think now all the events are evolving in complexity because you need to deal with security, you need to deal with technology, more and more constraints in terms of the legal framework, the sponsoring. However, there is a difference for me between an event, a major event, as Shona said, and a mega event. The second thing I wanted to stress was, for me, hosting a mega event is a political statement. It means that the territory, the leadership, takes a responsibility to undertake a very complex project, agrees to deal with many stakeholders with sometimes conflicting interests, agrees also to become more visible, and that means more media scrutiny, more opportunities for advocacy to be heard. And this political statement is true on the domestic and the international level. And the last thing I wanted to stress was what is interesting, and it was clearly shown in Beatrice's presentation, is when you look at the evolution of mega events, you have a stroboscopic view of the evolution of our society, not only in terms of clothes, but also in terms of politics, in terms of communities being heard more and more. And that's something which is really important, because for me, one of the values of the mega event is that they do not happen every year. And for me, a mega event cannot be repeated every year. You need to have a type of latency. It's not Christmas every day. And the value of the Olympics, the value of the FIFA World Cup, the value of the World Expo is also linked to the scarcity. People are expecting these elements. So these were the different elements I wanted to stress. And maybe the last one, it was mentioned by Beatrice in her lecture, the question of the governance. For me, as I said, a mega event is a catalyst for change, and is the opportunity for the territory to change from a vertical organization, transport, security, utilities, to something more transversal, because you have the constraints of the time. You are shifting from a business as usual and design to cost approach to a design to time approach. And that means that the relationship you will have with your stakeholders needs to be flexible enough so you can seize new opportunities. I remember, you are in the UK, I remember in June 2003, the British government announced that the cost of the games, and they were working with Arab at that time, June 2003, they said the cost of the games might be £1.79 billion. In October 2012, after the games, the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games, the cost of the games were assessed quite precisely at 8.9. But the most interesting thing is 1 year prior to the games, 2011, the budget of the LOCOG and all the Olympic entities was 9.8. So you shifted from 1.79, 9.8, and then 8.9. And why is it interesting? It's interesting for me because it means that the organization, the organic approach of the organization needs to be very well developed, and you need to be able to seize new opportunities And when you are just focusing on the element of cost, you are missing opportunities. When you are bound to take into account the time element, then you can see new opportunities. And the London Games, even though I am French, and I'm so sorry we lost against London, more seriously, they delivered an incredible games. It was efficient, it was passionate, on the financial level, it was excellent. So for me, what is really interesting is to see that when a host territory decides to host a mega event, they are obliged to change the way they will run the project. They need to be more transversal, and that will bring new opportunities. And for me, that's the proto element of a smart city, a new organization, more flexible and more transversal.
Philippe and Shona, thank you both so much for these comments. Beatrice, I think you probably want to respond to this, and we also have the chat. The chat has kind of blown up a bit, and we have quite a few questions queuing as well. So why don't you respond to Shona and Philippe for starters?
Yes, thank you. And it's fantastic to see the chat as well alongside. So let's see how much we can cover. Everything will be also recorded. So there is more, and there will be more things that I will be happy to put out there in the aftermath of this discussion. Well, lots of different points to start our conversation between the three of us. The point that Shona was making about the growth of the Edinburgh Fringe and the value or not of also having a break, no? That kind of theoretical question of would we benefit if we were forced to stop? Which also goes to that point that Philippe was making about the value of mega events in it being one in a generation, once in a lifetime. How does this compare with discontinued? You know, even if it's once a year, it's not the same as once every 4 years and in the same city. So yes, there is that question about the benefit of taking perspective, you know, the benefit of taking a break for a festival like Edinburgh, vis-a-vis the benefit of continuity, no? Like carnivals, like the kinds of events that you just want to be there in a regular basis because they are very defining of your identity. So I would like to push that a bit further and obviously have that conversation that is around infrastructure and the capacities for festival cities to cope if they are in continual mode. But then in parallel, if I link it up to the point by Philippe about the value of the special occasion and the Olympics, attempting to do that, I think what is being very interesting with the Olympic narrative is that actually we are reaching the point of almost a continual Olympics, no? Because we have summer, winter, and youth Olympics. So obviously one thing is the experience of the city, and the city, an Olympic city, will probably only have that experience once in a generation. But from the perspective of the spectators or the followers, there is almost like an ongoing conversation, like a permanent Olympic. So it's being very interesting in terms of the notion of the mega event and with developments like Olympic Channel and so on, what is happening, which is something that the arts world has also been exploring. No? There are lots of, for instance, in the arts biennial world, there is this discussion of the permanent biennial, no? Whether there is value of having this conversation happening on a regular basis. So yes, I keep thinking about this, the point of the mega event and the special significance, the balance between continuity of being there on a regular basis and the benefit of taking a break, of having silence, no? Having a period of time when you don't really do the event. There is that point about Festival 2022, and yes, I had a slide about this Festival UK 2022. For those that are not based in the UK, this is generating quite a conversation, and in the context of what has been going on this year, whether actually we can justify a new event as opposed to just supporting the existing festivals or cultural and event sector. But this could be quite a different conversation. So we'll see whether we can touch on that with more detail. So maybe what I would want is to bring both Shona and Philippe into taking this point. On the one hand, about continuity vis-a-vis the exceptional occasion, and the other, that is this question of size. So the final point that Philippe was making was about how all mega events started small, and obviously they have grown over time. The points I was trying to make when questioning the notion of mega events and whether we can go beyond that trio, no, of Olympics, World Cup, and Expo, is that we are witnessing an exponential growth in other types of events. And that if we value them from the point of view of significance and depth of impact on people, in some cases it's actually comparable. And it's interesting to see how the World Expo is perceived nowadays. No? So how many people are aware of where a World Expo is happening on a given year? It's very big and very important for the nation hosting it, but is it a global event in the same way as it used to be? And how does this compare with these new kids on the block? No, the European capitals of culture, the other things that, again, might not be known globally, but within a continent might actually be important and certainly can take over the narrative in a country for a particular year. So this notion of fluidity and the fact that the position is not permanent and that we might be judging, you know, yes, what is the most significant event? It's something that really changes depending on your peer network, depending on your interests. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. Yes, Shona.
I think I was kind of I was smiling when Philippe identified those three things as the only mega events, because I don't know if you've been to Edinburgh in August, Philippe, but we sold 4.5 million tickets collectively between us in August last year. I'd say it's a fairly mega event. I think what was interesting for us this year, whenever we cancelled, was the outpouring of love. Actually, you know, for all the kind of negative narrative that had built up over the last couple of years, suddenly the nostalgia, also the stories, the people who had grown up, and the most important thing to them was the fireworks at the close of the festival every year, the stories that come out from individuals who had met their first love at the festival and have now been married 30, 40 years. It was, you know, just this kind of outpouring of nostalgia and kind of love and missing. And then the very sort of real piece was the economic impact. The cultural impact and the economic impact, cultural producers wondering, oh my God, I've created this piece of work, who's going to see it, how's it going to be toured, you know, what's my livelihood beyond this? The economic impact from all of the restaurants, the bars, the printers, the publishers, the joiners who build the pop-up structures that make the festival happen every year. That kind of huge loss of income and a massive blow to the economy, from bus drivers to taxi drivers to just impacted on everybody. So I think there's an interesting point as well in the mega sporting events. I mean, I just find the figures astronomical. 9.8 billion. That's probably about 500 times the size of the annual arts budget for a whole country. I'd love somebody to do an analysis of the kind of the impacts of these events, the impacts of a kind of major art festival that takes over a city versus you know, an Olympic Games that happens every 4 years. I'm being provocative here, Philippe, deliberately.
With 9.8 billion, you could probably run a functioning test and trace system. Over to Philippe, and then I think we should go to the questions. At least try to answer some of them, because there's a lot of them coming in. We've got a very engaged audience here. So Philippe.
it's probably my English. I didn't want to be derogatory when I was minimizing the concept of mega events to the three governing bodies that I have mentioned earlier. Because there is one thing we haven't mentioned, it's the concept of universality for me. Yes, we have a host territory. Yes, we are bringing people from all over the world, but in reality, these three events, they aim to represent our humanity, and all the selection processes. So I fully agree with you, Shona. In terms of complexity, we have the same functional areas from accommodation, accreditation, security protocol, the 50 or 51 everyone knows. I agree also that the magnitude is high, and as we know, complexity is not growing linearly but exponentially. And for instance, if I look at the Asian Games, in terms of size, they are bigger. The Summer Asian Games are bigger in terms of attendance, number of sports, number of venues. They are bigger than the Olympics. But for me, there is this specificity, this elite club, where, as I said, some scarcity, not every year. As Beatrice said, a rotation of the different places. All these elements for me are supporting the idea of we are, sorry for my French, but we are becoming one. It's a notion of togetherness, which is really catalyzed by these three elements. For the rest, and since we are talking about culture, yes, it's very important to present your culture. It's very important to embrace other cultures. But for me, this notion of universality and having a privileged time in our lives where we are all together, either physically or over the phone, Zoom, or on the television, this is something very, very unique and special.
They used to call it Exposition Universelle, didn't they? Is that what it was originally?
But the first one in 1851, with the London vision, and we need to bear in mind it was the time when you had the Queen Victoria, and it was, as I said earlier, it was a political statement. It was the opportunity for the United Kingdom to London to present its excellence in many, many fields. And it has been, as Beatrice said, it has had an incredible transformative impact on the very city of London, and many, many things are still visible, but also it's still visible for us who are not British. It's also visible in the culture. People are still remembering, not necessarily consciously, but this notion of grandeur of the British Empire. And after that, there have been a kind of change. They created the Bureau International d'Exposition, the governing body for World Expo, because they were willing to piggyback on what was done initially, and they realized it might be something interesting. But the inception of the World Expo with the greatest exposition in Crystal Palace was, for me, something really incredible.
But I mean, the point that you have made, and where with universality, and I keep seeing the questions, and I'm having ideas about how these questions will be answered, which can also be done. I can commit to doing some kind of Q&A paper that we can publish in the School of the Arts, because there are many of these questions that are fascinating. So regardless of how much we can get on with today, but a very important point that has been raised by Philippe, and also connects to some of the concerns and also the questions coming over from the floor. And it has to do with that governance. So when we're talking about universality and the types of events that have the power to bring the world together, obviously our notions of the world keep evolving, no? Because it's true, when the Exposition Universelle and even with the Olympic Games when they started, it was a very Western world and very European-centric, and then progressively kept expanding. The world that we have now is a world that is very fragmented because we don't really have collective moments of watching. I mean, that period of time when it was possible to claim there are 2 billion people watching an opening ceremony, you know, this whole era in the 80s and 90s. And I was in the Center for Olympic Studies. We did all the work on television in the Olympics, and the whole conversation about what it means to have the world watching something simultaneously, how powerful that concept might be, is something that has dissolved, no? Because now we are watching on demand. We are doing it at different points in time. So again, governance. Who has the authority to say, I am behind an event of global significance? No, the IOC, the Bureau International d'Exposition, FIFA, that of course, there's all the discussions around as well, corruption. Who gives you the right, no, to have this role and to have universal value? Who else could do that? There have been several attempts from the cultural world, no? The Universal Forum of Cultures, they tried to be the Olympics of culture, the environment, and you know, this whole other parallel conversation that was supposed to be an alternative to the World Expo and the Olympics. And it didn't happen in that way. In the arts world, we keep having the conversation as well. How to create a global conversation, how to do the parallel to the international federations of sport, and how to, you know, create a structure. So it's fascinating to think from a governance point of view, how can, you know, what is the situation now? And from a world together point of view, how do we generate those moments? Yes.
We need to bear in mind that the governing bodies are also living entities. In the 1970s, 80s, the IOC was bankrupt. They were just collecting money from stamps and coins, philately and numismatic, and it is the intelligence and the willpower of President Summerant who was able to change the business model. But I know I'm talking to scholars and people who have much more experience and academic background than myself, but I was in charge of the Olympic Studies Center when I took over, when I created this new department in the IOC. And I was really surprised spending time with people like Beatrice and others. I was really surprised to see that the IOC nearly disappeared, and UNESCO and some thinkers were trying in the 1970s and 80s to stop the games being under the responsibility of the IOC, to be put under something more international, and which was UNESCO. What do I mean by that? I want to stress that we are talking about something which is a multi-stakeholder environment. And one of the elements which is for me important to address is the power, the balance of power between the different multi-stakeholders is different whether you address an event, a major event, or a mega event. And as I said earlier, the political side, some people are complaining that mega events are political, but that's the very nature of these events. We cannot forget that Beijing 2008 was 1 year prior to the 2009 60th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, and 2010 the World Expo in Shanghai. So China decided to have 2008, 2009, 2010, the sport power, the military power, and the economic power. So the decisions of the countries participating in the bidding process, they know they will collect a lot of momentum. It will be a kind of a sounding board, this bidding phase. But when they win, they have also the opportunity to use an exceptional springboard to project their vision in terms of societies and communities.
Completely.
So So Beatrice, shall we see if we can pick up two? I mean, there are some recurring themes in some of the questions. Obviously, there's some that are COVID related and wanting to know, you know, is there time for a rethink or what happens next? There's a question for Shona about very specifically about the coming year. There's a more. I feel like we had two questions in advance, and one of them you answered. Which was from Emi Ohashi, who's an events management student in Japan, who asked about Tokyo. But there's also a question from Viv Nelson, who's an MA student at John Moores in Cities, Culture and Creativity. And she's asked a question that's similar to one that's come in first here. So somebody here from Pont Office has said, how can one measure significance factors, which are more subjective perceptions? And
Yeah.
Viv has asked, how can researchers ever measure effectively the sheer joy or distaste that these events can bring to their area? So I suppose this matters to organizers as well, because they need to be able to provide evidence, you know, of the impact or effect. So how do you go about measuring these things, which are not as easy to measure as, say, numbers through turnstiles and so on?
Yes. Well, so the one is actually to understand and accept that these kinds of measures are equally important. So stop forcing, you know, the answers just to be into what is easier to capture. We really have to understand the qualitative factors. So we have been doing that. That was the big approach that we tested with the Impact 08 program, and this is now becoming more and more expected. So the notion of cultural value. So what this involves is also speaking to people. So having the time to engage on narrative analysis, not just on indicators and doing a statistical analysis. And in order to understand significance, then what you also need to do is to do it repeatedly and over time. So what happens with any qualitative process is that often can get dismissed as anecdotal. No, if you are just talking to people, as you cannot really gather the same volumes of information as if you were dealing with stats. And we get tempted to think that if it's a number, it seems to be more true. It rings true because it is a number. We would always argue, actually, the belief and the understanding of it can be as fictional. It can be as easy to misunderstand as a lot of the qualitative evidence. So it's about engaging in the narrative analysis, in asking questions, in establishing conversations, and then doing so repeatedly and in as many places as possible. So there is a whole network now of researchers that is growing up, trying to develop, for instance, approaches to cognitive mapping, different ways of establishing conversations, and doing that across the world. And when you have those kinds of changes happening, and resulting in similar reactions in places as different as Tokyo, Sydney, Vancouver, Barcelona, then you're getting something meaningful. It's not an anecdote. It's actually evidence that should be believed and valued. So it's now we are getting into accumulating and yes, raising the game so that we stop dismissing qualitative evidence as something that is just subjective or partial. And yeah, there are work, the Center for Cultural Value here in the UK is actually pressing on precisely with that agenda. So we are getting there.
So Shona, I'm presuming you have to do annual evaluations to discuss the impact and so on. So do you want to come in and answer that? But also we have a question from Abdullah Al-Nabati who says to Shona, what do you think the future of the event will be next year? I assume this means Edinburgh. What impact will COVID-19 might have on attendees planning to attend next year?
Yeah, on the first one, I think, I mean, I totally agree with Beatrice. I think the sophistication in how to capture qualitative measures has grown exponentially in the last number of years. We also work with the Cultural Value Project and the Cultural Value Centre, and there are so many external organisations who are fascinated by the Edinburgh Fringe, by its backstory, by its evolution, that every year there's new research that is developed that kind of really helps us capture, along with our own evaluations, which are both qualitative and quantitative. So I think it's like everything else, it's evolving in a very positive way, and a more sophisticated way. In terms of next year and the Edinburgh Fringe, I wish I had a crystal ball that I could specifically answer that question and affirmatively answer that question. What I can absolutely say is that that there will be an Edinburgh Fringe in 2021, and I can say that not being disingenuous, because there was actually an Edinburgh Fringe of sorts in 2020 as we pivoted, like everybody else, straight into the digital space. There were 300 shows that were online this year. Our support centre for artists went online. We had 12 international showcases, all online. And I think what's been really fascinating is how individual artists have actually found what new ways to innovate using the digital space creatively as part of the performance. And the most exciting work that I've seen in the last just in the last 3-4 weeks actually has been work that has really, I mean, I saw a show last weekend that had artists from Nigeria, from Singapore, from Uganda, from Colombia, from like 13 different countries who had never met each other in the same physical space, but were able to rehearse and put together a show that totally innovated the technology, and was a completely compelling piece of work performed in live time, but truly international in a way that I don't think most arts organisations could afford to do in the normal live space. So I think no matter what happens, we could have a live Fringe if the vaccines all become the kind of magic bullet that we hope. We will certainly at the very least have an element of live and an element of digital. And if all else fails, we've learned so much this year that it'll be an even more exciting kind of digital platform in 2021. So that's my answer to that.
Thanks, Shona. I'm going to pick out a couple of questions here for Philippe, particularly because they're around mega events and the meaning and his history of mega events. And Katarina Berger has asked, do you think that COVID and its implications present an opportunity to move away from gigantism and ever-growing mega events? And we have an anonymous attendee who's interested in the historical trajectory that we're describing here and wants to know what comes after the mega event. You know, we've gone from Exposition Universelle through to 2021. So a couple of questions for Philippe maybe to start with.
Thanks, Peter, for the questions. There is one thing I would like to stress, and it has started before COVID. That's the role of technology. If you look at the Olympic Games, the percentage of the operational cost is between 18 to 21%, which means that 700 million pounds for London, around $1 billion US dollars for Rio, probably the same amount for Tokyo. And what I want to stress is you cannot imagine a mega event now without a critical role provided by technology. But we were on a classical approach where technology was used mainly for disseminating the information, I would say broadcasting the information. With the COVID, there are more and more opportunities for engaging and interaction. And for me, that interaction is obviously important in the world of sports. I do believe esports is a natural extension of the physical sports. And I think there will be more and more combination of drones, of parkour, robots, esports in the near future. And COVID definitely accelerated, catalyzed that tendency. But there is also the role of technology in the staging of the event. And if we cannot be all together in the same physical place, we can have smaller communities elsewhere connected and also interacting with one another. For the moment, when I look at the World Expo, I was in charge of different elements for Dubai Expo 2020. And I started working on the technical dossier, the bidding file. And one of the elements we wanted to do with my colleagues and my leadership was to create the augmented expo concept, to make sure that we were anticipating the expectations from the younger generations. And we would build from the very beginning a physical infrastructure, but also a digital infrastructure. For different reasons, we have not delivered everything we wanted to do, but the COVID took us back and requested that there are some services, new, original, innovative services provided. So to answer the two questions, I would like to stress that the tipping point is definitely for me around digital technologies and the merging of sports and esports, the new relationship between, at least for sports, the field of play, the competitors and the fans. And this will have also, I think, but I'm speaking under the control of Shona and Beatrice, it has also probably an impact on the more artistic element, because we will have more engagement from the general public, and there will be parts of the artistic creation, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Philippe, and to all three of you for your responses. This is so fascinating. I think this could go on for quite a while, because we have a lot of questions. We've also now started to run over our allotted time. So, Beatrice, I don't know how you feel. I see you've typed something into the chat that you're going to try your best to respond to the other questions that came up. And I think we do have some contact details, so we're able to do that. Now, I also noticed that you've been typing in some answers to some of the questions as well. So I think people may have received responses for you. Was there any other question in the Q&A? I know we've seen a lot in the chat, but it's a bit harder to follow than the Q&A. Was there one more question that you wanted to pull out and quickly answer that caught your eye?
It's true that I was looking between the chat and the Q&A. So again, not a specific question, but in terms of the tone. So some of the issues that have emerged. So I'm very interested in those points that have to do about, if not the value of going smaller, the value of detail, of the attention to detail. So that there seem to be a lot of reactions that have to do with what this year has done to force us to get into a more reflective mode and to be more sensitive to detail, maybe to just stop the kind of race or the perception of a race that many of the events and event sector had got into. So I can say that in the festival world, there have been fascinating conversations on that front. I have just completed a whole period of discussions with the Salzburg Global Seminar, where we were discussing again the state of the arts festival world going forward, and fascinating notions have emerged, which is what I wanted with this session today to do. So how similar is that to the conversation that needs to occur within the mega event world? What we have been hearing from Shona and Philippe that has to do with the impact of being more creative in the way of using digital platforms. I think this might allow for some of the smaller scale approaches to occur. So to have both the large and the small. I think there are platforms we are now developing a capacity to understand or to appreciate what the digital environment can create in a way that brings maybe intimacy at the same time as we try to protect, the extravagance and the large scale. So I think this is a very interesting time for the future of mega events in ways that can be sensitive. And I'm thinking, for instance, the impact on opening ceremonies. In terms of the large scale ceremonies, there is incredible thinking being done about how to make them go beyond the model we are used to, just the stadium, the television screen. I mean, I think there are now ways of actually connecting to place, but also to your screens in ways that are going to be extraordinary. There were other questions that had to do with, whether they overclaiming, so whether we keep pushing, again, for very grand statements. What is the space, actually, in terms of documenting and explaining the stories to appreciate the tiny, the small, the individual experiences. And again, I believe that we have greater capacity to share those stories in ways that is even more adapted to different target audiences. So the one thing I also wanted to say before people leave, I have seen some, goodbyes and so on, is that I'm really going to do something with these questions. I have to figure out what format this could take, but it will be possible because there are many questions that are similar and related. So I'm going to have a go at exploring the questions that have come forward and having maybe some kind of answers or links to places where you can have more information, because we are committed at the School of the Arts certainly to having also the recording of this event be made available. So I'm very keen that it's not just the event, but also the conversation happening in parallel to have a space. I think it's very articulate questions. They are absolutely fascinating. So I think there is something very valuable that has to be done about it, especially because of the timing. And because I think for event organizers, it's very important that we have conversations such as this. Things are changing. And we are, I think our panelists, also many of the people attending, they are in positions to make a difference to, how we prepare and promote events that are coming up just in the next few years.
So to the audience, you've heard she's made a promise. There will be more to follow from this. I think I'm going to draw it to a close now, though. I just want to take the opportunity to thank all three of you for the richness of the discussion and the different perspectives that you've brought, quite different perspectives into this, and that's what's made the conversation so rich. To the audience, with the great questions in the chat and in the Q&A, big thanks to you. And we're sorry that we weren't able to answer them all live. It would have taken us 3 hours, I think. And just to say to Beatrice again, thank you so much for this great talk and the discussion that you've enabled. And let's make sure that it continues. So,
thank you. And wonderful to have such a great gathering.
Yeah. Thanks, Beatrice. Bye, everyone.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you. Bye-bye.
It was lovely to meet you, Philippe.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Sorry, there's no reception.
No, not really. This is what we really need for all of us and for all of you attending.